Hello, and welcome to today's Collective Impact Forum virtual coffee. I am Tracy Timmons-Gray, Community and Program Senior Manager of the Collective Impact Forum, and we are delighted to have you here with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. Next slide. Before we dive into our conversation with today's guests, I'm going to spend a few minutes orienting you to the session. Our conversation today will run for 60 minutes. We will spend roughly the first half of our time together hosting a discussion with my colleagues Hayling and John, and then we will open up to questions from all of you. You can put your questions in the chat box in the lower right corner of your screen. We will sort through them and try to get to as many as time allows. In addition, this session is being recorded, and we will be making that recording available in the next day or so. Please keep an eye out for an email announcing when the recording is up in the Collective Impact Forum library. We will be notifying the email you used to register for this virtual coffee. One note about handouts. You can find a copy of today's presentation and also a PDF of the article, The Water of Systems Change, available under the Handouts tab on the right of your screen. Just click on them and you will be able to download both directly from the webinar platform. Next slide. As I mentioned, please definitely share your questions in the question section. We also would appreciate if you would share any feedback and comments on Twitter. You can use the hashtags CI Virtual Coffee or the hashtag Collective Impact, or you can tag us at CI Forum Tweets. If you need technical assistance, you can ask questions in the questions box, or you can email us at info@collectiveimpactforum.org. Next slide. I'm delighted to introduce our two discussants today, Hayling Price and John Kania. First, let me welcome and introduce Hayling Price. Hayling is a senior consultant at FSG and has deep experience designing strategies to accelerate social change through collective impact. He works with a range of clients across sectors seeking to improve population-level outcomes with a primary focus on education and youth development. Hayling also serves as FSG's Equity Partnerships Lead, and in that role supports the firm's strategic priorities on equity related to business development, capacity building, and partnerships with the field actors and the advocacy community. Hayling is the co-author on the FSG publications Beyond the Classroom and Raising Blended Learners Year 1 Evaluation Report. Next, let me welcome John Kania. John Kania serves as Managing Director at FSG. With 30 years of experience advising senior management on issues of strategy, leadership, assessment, and organizational development, John has led dozens of strategic planning and evaluation efforts for foundations, nonprofits, and corporations. He has also been a leader in FSG's intellectual capital development related to catalytic philanthropy, collective impact, shared value, and systems change. John's publications works include co-authoring the articles Collective Impact, Understanding the Value of Backbone Organizations and Collective Impact, The Dawn of Systems Leadership, and most recently, The Water of Systems Change. With that, let me hand things over. Take it away, Hayling.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Great to be with you all today and excited to dive into this content with you. I had an opportunity to sort of be in conversation and serve as a thought partner to John and others as this process sort of unfolded over the past few months. So it's great to see this out in the field, and I'm looking forward to having the conversation with you all today. Hopefully we'll have some questions to get things going in a bit, but for now, wanted to kick things off with just sort of a general kind of overview of what the approach was and the genesis of this whole project. So John, we're talking about this article, The Water of Systems Change, that you co-authored with Peter Senge and Mark Kramer. And it's something we talk about a lot in FSG. Some might say it's actually in the water at FSG. But I guess for folks on the line, be interested to hear sort of how it came to be, what really piqued your interest about the topic, and why did you choose to write about it at this time?
Sure, Hayling, and hello to everybody who's on the line. So through our work in collective impact, which some of you are familiar with, and also through FSG's ongoing strategy work with social sector organizations, we've really, been increasingly encountering practitioners interested in this concept of systems change. It's sort of, systems change seems to be everywhere. I was in a yoga studio recently where there was a poster on the wall advertising the benefits of systems change. So there are a lot of people that are talking about this concept. And as many folks on the line may know, there's been much that's been written about systems change, but we were still finding that the notion of systems change remains not that well understood. And if you care about achieving social change, systems change is an important concept to understand. So we set out to write an article that would help land this concept of systems change in a way that staff members at nonprofits and foundations and other organizations doing social change work could have a dialogue about it and also engage with their boards on the topic of systems change. So it was really, the motivation here was to try to sort of land this in a way that folks could get their arms around and could start taking action against.
Cool. So we're talking about a pretty highfalutin concept, and some might say we're using a bit of jargon. So before we really dive into the weeds, can you really define system change for us? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so Hayling, this is an important question in and of itself. There are many, many definitions of systems change, and most of them are really difficult to understand. And I think for practitioners in the social sector, I also find that when they're talking about systems change, it's often talking about changing policy or changing or scaling effective practices. And the reality is that if you're really interested in changing systems, policy and scaling effective practices are two important dimensions, but they're not the whole kettle of fish. There are other dimensions that are as important, some might argue more important to think about in systems change than purely policy and practices. So when we sat down to write the article, we did an exhaustive search of the definitions for systems change. I think you might have been a part of that. And yeah, and we only found one definition out there to be compelling, and it's the one that we used in the article, and it comes from Social Innovation Generation in Canada. And maybe if we could flip the slide, please. Yeah, so here's just a picture of the cover of Water of Systems Change that we've been writing about, but maybe the next slide. Yeah, so here's the definition, that systems change is about shifting the conditions that are holding a problem in place. Shifting the conditions that are holding a problem in place. So it's an evocative definition, at least for me. It helps give you sort of a visualization of systems change. It's not the issue or the person, for example, that we need to fix. It's someone's homeless or someone's in jail that shouldn't be. It's the set of conditions that surround that issue or that individual that we need to work on. And again, this whole notion of shifting the conditions that are holding the problem in place, to me, really starts to get at the essence of what it is that we want to do in systems change. Of course, when you raise this notion of shifting the conditions, it then sort of begs the question of what exactly are the conditions, right? And so that's sort of was the jumping off point for the article, was to try to go deeper around this notion of the conditions that we need to shift, and could we come up with some ways of thinking about these conditions from the standpoint of really leverage to actually shift the system.
Great, thanks. And when we're talking about these conditions, John, I know that the article lays out these 6 particular sort of leverage points, and it may be helpful to go through layer by layer if we can advance to the next slide, and get a little voiceover on why each of these sort of conditions are so critical for system change and why practitioners really need to factor all these pieces in. So if we can advance to the following slide. Thank you.
So let me, before jumping into this framework, I want to begin by saying that both the article and the actual frame itself, or if folks have read it, it's targeted to foundations, but the framework itself, and what I'll just walk people through in a minute, we see as broadly applicable to really any participant in the social sector. So foundations, nonprofit, government, and business in their interactions when they're trying to support social change. And we've used this framework with collective impact initiatives, and it's really been quite powerful as an organizing mechanism for how a CI initiative should think about going about change. And hopefully we'll get a chance to unpack that in a bunch of different ways. But let's just deal with the framework here. So the framework itself, and we're starting with sort of the top level, but ultimately we talk about and we show 6 interdependent conditions that typically play significant roles in holding a social or an environmental problem in place. And they're at 3 levels. And right now we're looking at on the picture on the slide, sort of call it level 1, first level. It's the structural change level. It's the things that are explicit, that are evident, and that really everybody can see. Policies are pretty self-explanatory. Government, institutional, or organizational rules and regulations that guide people's practices and actions. Practices are the activities by practitioners and organizations that are targeted to improving social and environmental progress. Resource flows, how money, people, knowledge, information, other assets such as infrastructure are allocated and distributed. So again, this is the first level. These are things that you could do pretty good research on pretty quickly and get a sense of what's actually going on with your issue. Then we get to the next level. Click the slide, please. Great. These we call semi-explicit conditions, and there are 2. One is around relationships and connections, which we would define as the quality of connections and communication that occurs among actors in a system. And particularly, we're wanting to look at those with differing histories and viewpoints. And then there's power dynamics, which we would define as the distribution of decision-making power, authority, and formal and informal influence among individuals and organizations. So, when we think about collective impact, what's kind of interesting is that this should be, this particular level, for those of us who've worked in collective impact efforts, a lot of that is about rewiring relations and connections and bringing together people in the system who are working on the same issue or problem, but often don't talk to each other. I also find it interesting, and at least it's been my experience, that when we think about CI initiatives and power dynamics, collective impact can be a mitigating factor in power dynamics, or it can be a reinforcing factor in power dynamics. And we kind of come back to that. But these are what we would call semi-explicit. Sometimes you're aware if you're involved in a particular issue or your stakeholder. Sometimes you're aware that these relationships and connections and power dynamics exist, and sometimes you're not. That's why we call them semi-explicit. Then we get to the third level. And at the third level, the deepest level of systems change is mental models or mindsets. These are habits of thought that are really deeply held beliefs and assumptions and taken for granted ways of operating in terms of how we think and how we do, how we act. It's kind of a wonky term, mental models, but let me just give you a demonstration of that. If you were to sort of plop into a collective impact steering committee meeting, or just a meeting of a whole bunch of different types of stakeholders around whatever issue you're involved in, and you were to say, we need to do community engagement, I'm guessing there would be at least 5 or 6 different sort of mental models going on in different people's heads of what you meant when you said we need to do community engagement. Some people might think that means, engaging with nonprofit leaders. Others might think that means we need to engage with residents. Others might think that sorry, at least on my end got a little bit of interruption there. But so just back to community engagement and mental models that different people might have when we say the engagement aspect of community engagement. Some people might be thinking that's, about sort of consulting the community, and others might think that's about co-creation. So these are sort of the 6 conditions that we talk about, and we again think about them at these 3 different levels, from structural change at the top to transformative change, from explicit at the top to implicit. A couple other thoughts, just as you think about this model, as you think about this framework and how you might use it and use it with others in your community. It's important to note that while these are independent conditions and they can be defined, measured, and even targeted for change, they're also intertwined and they interact with each other. That interaction can be mutually reinforcing. So a change in community and legislator mental model might trigger a policy change. The interaction can also be counteracting. So scaling effective practices may be thwarted by poor relationships between players in the system. And again, the other thing is to really recognize that these happen at different levels of change and are different levels of sort of explicitness and levels of sort of structural to transformational. I think our experience has been that many foundations, many other players in the sector are often focused at this top level, and that the thought is if we can bring structural change about, that'll bring about systems change. But I think the reality is that it's the second and third levels that really sort of bring about long-term change, and very difficult to cement, if you will, systems change in the long term if you're not working at the second and third levels. And just a really quick example of that we give in the article using the Affordable Care Act enacted during President Obama's administration. The ACA was, as everybody knows, one of the largest shifts in policy flow and resources, the country had seen in decades, and millions of people who were previously excluded from healthcare have gained access to it. And it included numerous financial components that were intended to change practice and realign incentives. And so it created a lot of impact, huge impact at this first level of systems change. At the second level of systems change, it was successful in catalyzing stronger relationships between community and health providers, as both paid more attention to the social determinants of health. However, it was less successful in terms of sort of changing relationships between providers, insurance, pharmaceutical companies, and patients, and less successful in terms of altering the power dynamic between corporate lobbyists, political parties, congressional legislators on the one hand, and consumer and patient advocates on the other hand. So, fundamentally, even at this third level, and perhaps even most importantly, at this third level of sort of the mental models, the ACA wasn't real successful in instilling a new public narrative about why America's uninsured deserve access to healthcare in ways that broader healthcare coverage, or ways that broader healthcare coverage could strengthen global competitiveness. So again, the one example of something that worked really well at the top level, but has more work to do at the second and third levels of change.
Very helpful, John. Thank you for diving into some of the nuance there. On a related point, as we look across these three sort of tiers of the inverted pyramid, we have these parentheticals. There's explicit, semi-explicit, and implicit. As we think about the work, I think there's a conversation we were having, at least behind the scenes, putting some of this together on the significance of sort of how explicit some of these conditions are. And I thought it may be helpful to sort of unpack some of that for the audience today.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hayling, if you want to join this, because you were part of our conversation as we part of this conversation to develop the concepts. But when we first developed the framework, we looked at this as a spectrum from structural dimensions and conditions that are visible to mental models that are invisible. And that's in part right, because the conditions at the structural level are indeed more visible than the second and third level conditions. But we realized that we weren't accurately characterizing, in particular, the second and the third levels. And here's what I mean. What's invisible to some is not invisible to all. Take, for example, the Me Too movement's exposing of sexual harassment. You can say that for many people, and certainly many men, the mental model or even the power dynamics inherent in sexual harassment was invisible. So, like, many men did not understand the depth and the breadth of the problem. On the other hand, to those women experiencing sexual harassment, the mental model of their assailant was like very visible. So this would, also apply to when we think about people of color experiencing racism, disabled people experiencing ableism, and so on and so forth. So we went from sort of thinking about the spectrum from visible to invisible to explicit to implicit. It captures in part this visibility thing, but another way maybe to think about it that at least I've found to be helpful is that what we're really talking about here is how well named these three levels are, or these conditions at these three levels, and the degree to which they are named or can be named easily. At the structural level, it's easy to name policy, practice, and resource flows. At the second level, and we're talking about relationships and connections, and power dynamics. Sometimes we can name them. Sometimes there are things that, people that it's more uncomfortable to name. And then at the mental model level, I think, that really is the essence of social change is can we try to surface and can we try to name the different mental models that might exist when people are addressing this particular issue. And I gave the example before of community engagement and how many different mental models might exist around what is meant by the phrase community engagement. So, right. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Hayling, as we've thought about this.
Yeah, no, I think that captures it well, John. I think the pivot we made from the sort of visible to invisible to the sort of explicit to implicit is indicative of the fact that it depends on what part of the system you occupy and where you are in relation to power. So those who occupy power and have control over policies, practices, and resource flows, those who sort of hold the institutional levers, may not always see some of the challenges. The old metaphor, if someone's foot's on your neck, it's easier to feel that than sort of if you're hovering above. So I think in a number of ways, whether you're thinking about that dimensions of race, class, ability, et cetera, gender, there are a lot of sort of factors that will sort of determine whether or not you can see some of these conditions. So that was our thinking around whether or not we'd want to sort of describe it as explicit or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, we think it's an important consideration, especially as we try to center equity in this work and understand we need to meet folks where they are across communities doing systems change. So really, really glad we can sort of dive into that piece here. Another theme that you surfaced in the paper relates to this idea of sort of internal versus external conditions. And I've heard a few people speak to this idea of internal conditions lately, but I'd love to get your take on kind of what that means and how it really comes to life in this work for you.
Yeah, so, one quote we use in the article that comes from a mentor of Peter Senge's, Bill O'Brien, is that the success of the intervention is based on the interior condition of the intervener. And I think many people in the field have picked that up as a pretty powerful notion and, again, evocative of really something that's really hard to talk about, but put into words in, a very eloquent way. And, in the article, and, something that we really believe in our work is that as foundations or any other social sector organization or a collective impact initiative, as you consider the external dynamics of the systems change you wish to create, you've also got to consider the set of conditions internally within your own organization. And so said another way, each of these 6 conditions, as you think about them externally, think about them for your own organization or for your own CI initiative. A couple of examples that we give in the article is that, foundations, and I think most would, are aware of this, often distort the dynamics of social change through, the sort of the arbitrary timeline or time horizons shaped by their governance processes or the length of the grant cycle. And, that's a challenge of the structure and right. One we need to think about as an internal condition that potentially might impede change. As right. Well, when you think about, power dynamics, et cetera, there are often many power dynamics internal to the foundation they need to take into account as they think about external power dynamics.
Great. I know that's a journey we've been on just as a firm at FSG and something we're recognizing the need for players in the field to really think about as well. That's helpful. And speaking of the field, we're here in partnership with the Collective Impact Forum and sort of group of practitioners across the country, across the world who are thinking about how to integrate this work with the practice of collective impact. So really interested in hearing your thoughts on the intersection between systems change and the sort of nuts and bolts of CI, and in particular, how you're thinking about the time horizon and how you might segment out this work vis-a-vis how we've traditionally approached collective impact.
Yeah. So I think for most of us doing collective impact work, we would consider ourselves doing, in our steering committees and our working groups, sort of focused on systems change. Many, but not all. And it's been interesting. Since the article came out, I've had a number of different backbone leaders of CI efforts who once they've read the article, have sort of made it required reading for their steering committee. So I think it can be a really powerful way for collective impact efforts to organize their work. The other thing I guess I'd mention, and many doing CI work have sort of heard this expression that in many communities we are program rich but systems poor. And then, the CI initiative is developed, and the strategies that are developed in the CI initiative are, let's do more programs. They're not necessarily focused at the systems level. And I think part of that reason is because it's hard for a lot of people to get their arms around what does it mean to focus on systems strategies versus program strategies. There's just, we're all much more familiar with program strategies. And so I think it really can be, and we are starting to use this in the CI efforts that we've been involved in, as a way to, as we work with steering committee and in particular working groups or action teams on their strategies, is to say, okay, if you're focused on a particular dimension of the problem, can we start to ask ourselves which of these 6 conditions need to be shifted and where are their priorities? What's interesting is I think it creates a powerful conversation fairly quickly, and one of, I think, the key intents that we had, as I said up front, was making sure that people don't spend all their time focused on policies, practices, and resource flows, that they look at these deeper dimensions. And I think these deeper dimensions are things that collective impact efforts can focus on if they have some level of intent. So, that's sort of one key thing, is just to see this as a way to organize for systems strategies. I think one of the other things that comes up, and I know, Hayling, you've sort of mentioned that you experience this a lot when you're out sort of sharing this framework, is people look at this and they say, okay, where do we go? Where do we go first? Do we select one of these? And I think the reality is that it's hard for an individual organization to engage in all 6 of these. In the article, we talk about California Endowment, and they actually are engaged in all 6 of these in their work in building healthy communities, but it's really super hard for one organization. But when you think about, a collective impact effort, multiple organizations can really start to wrap their arms around, many of these. And so I think in some respects, a collective impact initiative is much better set up to address, really all these dimensions than to try to focus on one. And, where should you go first? Well, as I said up front, you're not going to get long-term change unless you work at the 2nd and 3rd level. On the other hand, the 2nd and 3rd level often are harder and more challenging to address. And, getting, as many know, getting, some quick successes in a collective impact effort is important as well. And not that the first level is easy either, but I think really thinking about a portfolio of strategies that begins to move the system, portfolio of complementary strategies that begins to move the system as a whole, is really the way to go. You asked the question about sort of, how long does it take? Can we shift to the next slide? So this is one picture and way that we think about systems change and, changing the conditions in the context of collective impact. So, if you're engaged in a CI initiative, you can see sort of the short, the medium, and the long-term change. And in the short term, you're going to see changes that sort of enable better collaboration. That the theory is, if we're better at collaborating, we will achieve better outcomes. So you put a backbone in place, you have a common agenda, people are starting to work together differently. Those are all sort of year 0 through 2 things that you can accomplish. The long-term population level changes often are going to take 5 or more years. Where the systems change strategies come into place is in the middle. So if we can think about these 6 conditions of policies, practices, resource flows, relationships and connections, power dynamics, and mental models, that's the middle box. And those are going to happen at different rates, but you can see progress on those in the medium term, in years 2 through 5. And if you can start to have, your effort appreciate this sort of short, medium, and long term, and what can be done in the short, what can be done in the medium, and what can be done in the long term, we can start to think about what it takes to shift the systems that hold the problem in place.
That's great. Thank you, John. I was just having a conversation with a backbone leader a few hours ago about this dilemma, or maybe a false choice between programmatic and system strategies, and sort of where to begin and how. And I love the language you used around a sort of portfolio of system strategies, which may include some programmatic interventions, may think about everything from the flows of capital to the social fabric and social capital of the community, but it's really how you tie that all together and kind of hold the interconnectivity to move the work. That's great. Thank you. So we've got a few questions we'll dive into from the crowd in just a second, but wanted to see if there were any other thoughts you wanted to share before we started fielding those from our participants.
Love to hear what's on people's minds.
Okay. So I think the mental model piece is always worth further conversation. It's a bit thornier than some of the other systems conditions, and maybe worth unpacking a bit. So if you could perhaps share a bit around how this comes into play in community, and we have a narrative from the field. Someone's mentioning that they work in a rural community or across rural communities where relationships and connections are strong, but perhaps they don't feel as equipped to address mental models. So how do you think about someone who's maybe better positioned to address that middle tier of the inverted pyramid, but is struggling to really penetrate around the mental models?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I guess a couple of thoughts. One is that it is great to hear that relationships and connections are, that it sounds like there's trust there. Our experience has been that it is really difficult to shift mental models unless there is trust. A lot of this stuff ends up being not rocket science, but sort of common sense for people who work in situations where you're trying to help people get along and help people to agree. So, right. I mean, strategies that, when you say, shifting the mental models, sometimes there are various constituencies. You say there's a constituency of, I don't know, people that live in community A and people that live in community B. And, they have very different mental models about, they both live on the lake and they have very different mental models about what's polluting the lake. And, community A thinks that, it's the factory upstream that's creating pollution. Community B feels like, there's, it's more polluted, but that's just the inevitable, that's the inevitable change. And so they've got two different mental models. Well, getting to a different mental model, having folks who might be more willing to agree from either community A or community B to start to socialize a different way of thinking, is one particular way of going at it. I think, what we have found in our collective impact efforts is that, often when we say, people get along well together, they're not really talking about things that are difficult to talk about that they disagree on. And that we've got to create an environment and sort of a level of deeper trust. And, the jargon is create a container where people can get to say what they need to say and express where they're coming from in a way that they can both feel heard and that they can start to listen. And so, again, these are very, very basic things, but really difficult unless you do, you take this groundwork and you do this groundwork as opposed to saying, why don't you believe in my mental model? Sure.
That's helpful. On a related note, thinking about shifting mental models, we got a question around nudges. So there's been a lot of great research over the past decade or two on kind of the behavioral science and economics behind persuasion. So as you think about sort of leveraging connections and relationships to push mental models, what role do you think those kind of behavioral nudges can play in moving the needle, if any?
Well, I mean, I think I'm not sure exactly what the author of the question is referring to. So I can go quickly out of my league here. All of which is to say, I think what we're seeing is that attention to mental models means that you're going to try to address things in a different way. I am a big fan of the Frameworks Institute and the work around, trying to, in the social sector, trying to help organizations shift mental models. And
right.
a lot of their work is around saying, okay, they were one of, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think they were the ones who really helped, develop the term toxic stress. And, what they're focused on is that, there's sort of, people have an association in their mind that it's very fixed, and it's a way that, everything comes together. And until you can figure out a way to replace that with another sort of image or frame or way of thinking about things, it's really hard to shift mental models. So a lot of what they do is to do the research into the ways that people are thinking today and what causes them to frame things in a certain way and what the predominant social frame is. And then what are some alternative frames that might actually, replace the existing frame that they have. And it's got to be something that, in some respects appeals to them. It's got to be a more effective frame that, would work. We think about the gay rights movement, for marriage, and we talk about that a little bit in the article, when they were, when they moved from framing things as, it's a right to, two people in love should be able to get married, that new frame actually worked for people in a way that the old frame didn't.
Yeah, and there's some other great examples in the article of sort of campaigns to perhaps, I don't know if you would use the term win hearts and minds, but certainly persuade mental models in terms of policy reform and other initiatives.
Yeah. I mean,
great.
Just to go a little bit deeper on that, or more on that, I think we're hearing a lot more about quote unquote narrative in our field than we used to. And I think there's a reason for it. If you go back to the inverted pyramid, is that, again, you can be working at those higher levels, but unless you've changed the narrative, unless you spend time trying to change the narrative, you're not going to get long-term sustainable change.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. There's another theme or frame that we've actually been talking about quite a bit at FSG, both internally and externally, and that's around psychological safety. This isn't a connection I would have necessarily made in the past, but I think it's a great question that we got from another participant today, and that is, so how do you think about creating a safe space for folks to really inquire in earnest as you're having these difficult conversations? And how do you set the table so that folks with different mental models can really come together in hope of sort of shared understanding?
So I'm going to ask you to answer that first, and then I'll...
Sure. So that's certainly part of the work we do at FSG, and I can provide some perspective. So often when we're in communities facilitating conversations around strategy development and sort of co-designing community-led solutions, we think a lot about what we might call a container for the work, and that is a sort of holding environment or a set of physical and sort of psychological conditions where folks feel like they can really communicate in earnest. There's no such thing as a dumb question. There is a sort of sense of mutual respect and a focus on work that we hold together. So I think before we ever get into unpacking any data or any deliberative strategy around which pieces of these system change conditions we want to move on, we think about how to really set the table. And that is acknowledging that we all have different biases, different priors and understandings of the work. There's a a device we use that some on the phone may be familiar with, this idea of the ladder of inference. So that is, I might process data differently from you because of past experiences we've had. So for instance, as, I don't know, as a consultant, I think often in frameworks. That may not be the intuition for someone who's coming from a direct services environment. So I have my sort of default disposition for approaching the work, and I need to kind of name that and understand that I'm going to interpret the facts differently. I think in a more visceral way, as a Black man who grew up in this country, I often have my lens colored by experiences that me and members of my family have had over time. And as I reflect on that, I have to sort of name that stepping into the conversation. I think those who occupy relative positions of power, whether it's through dimensions of ability, race, gender, class, et cetera, are sort of better positioned to support the work if they're able to name that coming into the conversation. And I think once you put that all on the table, you've created a healthy container to really start getting into the weeds and saying, okay, my mental model is here, yours might be in a different place, but I think we're prepared to sort of jointly have a cross-model conversation. So it's almost like clearing the air.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that was great, and thank you for sharing that. What I would add to it is that it's really difficult to do everything that Hayling spoke about if the people who are in positions of power going in aren't open to that and aren't willing to be vulnerable themselves and aren't willing to support that. And, you know, I mean, we're involved in a CI effort in a major US city where it was very clear, and we didn't know this up front, that, you know, the mayor was not going to support that. And that just didn't allow the work to proceed. You know, I can think of other initiatives where, you know, we've had the district superintendent in the room and, you know, other key people in positions of power, and they have invited the sort of interactions and exchange that that Hayling has talked about. And you know, and for better or for worse, people look to those individuals in position of power to see how they're responding to it and how they're modeling in that work. And if they're intentionally modeling vulnerability themselves, then I think the work can proceed well. It becomes a lot harder if the people in positions of power, and that could be, you know, from whatever constituency, you know, are not supportive of working in this way. And so that's a trick. I mean, that's a trick to the relationship. It's just, it doesn't mean you can't do everything Hayling talked about. It just means you're going to need to do it slower and bring people along.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think there's somewhat of a scientific sort of precision involved with locating some of the work and thinking about the technical aspects of resources, et cetera, but it's certainly a fine art when we talk about creating the generative space it takes to have these kinds of conversations, for sure. Another question from the group. Do we look at systems change as a cyclical process? Is it helpful to think about kind of an iterative cycle, or do we look more longer term and sort of approach this as a linear process going forward? To what extent is it helpful to sort of reset as you pursue this work in communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a process where you should assume that you're in the work of constant change, and not only that you know, you can make great progress and also experience setbacks that have nothing to do with how effective you are. Example of that, we supported an effort around youth substance abuse, you know, in a major U.S. city. The effort made significant progress against, you know, lowering, you know, drug usage over the course of 5 years. Some really powerful things came out of it. Then the opioid crisis hit, and there's a whole new set of issues that, you know, the initiative is having to deal with that they didn't have before. So that's an example of, you know, one where, you know, I mean, it was a really great success story, and then, you know, we got to start, you know, we got a whole new set of strategies that we need to think about. So I think it's definitely cyclical. You know, yeah, I ever changing, nonlinear, yes. Constant course correction, if we go back to the 6 conditions, constant attention to those 6 conditions, how those are changing and how they're interacting and the alchemy that they create and how that changes the situation. Yeah.
So our last, I'm guessing this may stem to the last question we just addressed, but someone's asked for us to talk about strategies for addressing power dynamics. So I think that relates a lot to this idea of creating a container and sort of addressing this psychological safety piece. So how do you think about power dynamics? I think we've been in the room together for a few examples where this comes up.
Well, maybe I'll say some things, and then you can talk to what you have in mind. I mean, this is like the third rail, and I think, one of the realities is that often the CI efforts are put together with many people who are actually, players in the system, right? In positions of formal authority who actually do have power. And I think it's one of the things that we're all up against, and I think about it every day, that, because most of our clients are folks who would consider, are really, system players that are in sort of formal positions of power. Not all of them, but many of them are. And, increasingly, our focus in CI efforts is to make sure that we do try to, we do our absolute best to level the playing field and bring in a much more inclusive set of folks who are actually involved in the work. But another way to sort of think about it too, and there's actually been a really great article written about this a couple of years ago, is that there's inside strategies and outside strategies when it comes to long-term change. And sometimes you do need sort of outside community organizing. I'll call it community organizing as sort of more the quote unquote outside strategy that really needs to put pressure on the system in ways that those working within the system can't. And, I even talked to a district superintendent who, was working in a collaborative way with community organizers in a way that he was like, they can say things and should say things that I can't in the position that I'm in, and I need somebody to say those things. So I think, this is a deep topic that, much has been written about, and there's, is great experience in the world about, but, I think at one level it's thinking about sort of, when do you need truly outside strategies and who can deliver those? And, when is it, how do you combine working, within the system versus outside the system, if you will? And then there's sort of a whole set of ways that you, in these efforts, I think, need to attend to power dynamics, and that may be more, Hayling, what you were thinking about.
Yeah, and this ties another question that just came in. I think it's helpful to maybe connect it to someone's elevating the importance of participation and co-ownership from both the content experts and also those who have local lived experience. So how do we sort of incorporate that principle into the approach? That's very much embedded in how I think about addressing power dynamics here. So some of this is really part of good practice for collective impact writ large, which is thoughtful governance that's really representative of the community you're intending to serve. So how do we split up between those with traditional kind of formal authority, whether it's foundation, government, business, nonprofit leaders, often what we may call the grass tops, along with parents, families, community members, activists, organizers, and those who are often at the front lines of this work and do have often the best perspectives. I know a team we're supporting here at FSG will be in community this week talking with a number of young folks and parents before we ratify any strategies through the collective impact project we're supporting in this particular community. So for us, I think it's about tempering whatever sort of technocratic, expertise-driven approach we take with a really sharp lens toward how this is impacting folks in community, some may call beneficiaries and users, but ultimately the folks who are going to experience these population level outcomes in the long run, hopefully, are going to have not only a seat at the table, but really inform strategy in a way that may counteract traditional power dynamics that we'll often walk into, right, in communities. If we're hired by a foundation to do work in a particular area, it may be that they haven't always had the friendliest relationship with stakeholders in that community, or perhaps there are different factions in the advocacy and activist circles that are at odds with other folks at the table. And one frame I like to return to is how to put that power in the hands of those who are used to speaking truth to power. So that is, if you were to think about this, to put it crudely, in sort of a supply and demand dynamic for social change. You've got the activists, maybe PTA parents, if we're talking about an education example, perhaps climate activists in environmental situations, who are demanding social change. And those who sort of control the resources, the policies, practices on the supply side. Well, what happens if that's shifted and we get those folks in the room and say, hey, we know you've been showing up to these hearings, you've been protesting, and we want you to now inform how we'll be providing solutions. So I think there's a really critical inflection point where folks sort of shift, if you will, from that demand side to the supply side. And I think as we incorporate those voices into the sort of design and provision of sort of solutions, we're hopefully addressing some of the power dynamics that will exist in these communities. And that's an approach we should take, hopefully, to addressing each of those 6 nodes on that inverted pyramid we showed earlier. I think it's something that's relevant from the resource piece down to the mental models. Yeah, so maybe we have time for one more question. We have a few more coming in. This is interesting. There's what some might call a chicken and egg issue between the requirement of new mental models to gain political support for these changes, but you may also need lived experiences that one gains through shifted structures to facilitate that shift. So I guess the idea is one might be convinced a solution is viable once they've lived through it, but how do you convince someone if they haven't seen it yet? How do you sort of invoke a mental model shift if they haven't yet experienced something new? It's a great question.
Yeah, it is a good question. I think one of the things that we found to be effective that we've learned from Peter Senge and his colleagues in the System Leadership Institute that they've been doing for years are collaborative, what they call learning journeys. And they actually began these by working on food sustainability and sort of more sustainable supply chains. This will come back to our work in a second, but just to give you the derivation of this, they, took CEOs of large companies like Unilever and small international NGOs that were working in the field with smallholder farmers in Africa, and they went to look at what was happening on the ground, and they brought a set of folks together, again, CEOs of big, large companies, and brought them into the field with others and looked at what was going on, saw different solutions, and had conversations and built trust and built understanding. And so this notion of learning journey, I think, can be really powerful if you haven't experienced it. And it's not one where it has to be set up right. It's not one where, you go and observe what's going on. It's a very different type of experience. But I think it can be a very powerful, it doesn't substitute for the actual experience itself, but it certainly brings it much more to life for those who might not have access to that normally, or might not choose to have access to it.
Yeah, the lived experience piece comes up a lot, and even if it's not necessarily an environment, a community, a neighborhood you grew up in, just the physical proximity to the folks experiencing those conditions and witnessing those firsthand can do a whole lot to open up people's eyes to the possibility of shifting those mental models. Yeah. So we're going to close out in just a minute, but before we did, I wanted to pause to see if you had any closing thoughts or perhaps a charge or challenge to our listeners today as we think about going forth with this framework.
Yeah, well, I would just say, again, I think the motivation for the article was to sort of put a holistic frame around systems change so that people were thinking about all 6 of these and not just 1 or 2. And in particular, to think about levels 2 and levels 3 and not skip over those because those are sort of deeper, more fundamental, what we call transformational levels. If you just deal at the top level, you get structural. Where you really want to get transformation in a system is the second and the third level. So they're really hard. You know, they don't come easily, but if this is the work you want to do, I really encourage you to learn more about those areas and start to do work in them. Or find others who can.
Fantastic. Definitely. Thank you, John. Well, it's been a pleasure thinking about this work with you over the past several months, and I'm glad we had a chance to talk about it more today. Looking forward to carrying it forward with you.
Thank you.
All right. And with that, I'll pass it off to Tracy, who will close us out.
Wonderful, Hayling and John. And could we move to the next slide? First, a big thank you to Hayling and John and to all the attendees for joining us today and for sharing your questions. A big shout out to everyone's patience for our audio issues for the first part. Let me just say that the session was fully recorded, and we will be happily sending that full recording to you later on today. So please keep an eye out on your email. We will be sending that to the email that you used to register for this virtual coffee. I'm also happy to share about some upcoming learning events, both virtual and in person. We are continuing our virtual coffee dialogues over the summer, and you can join us for our next one on July 17th. That is next week. That will feature a discussion on building leadership capacity with the Collective Impact Initiative, Vermont Farm to Plate. And hopefully we'll get all our issues worked out by next week. For those looking for an in-person experience, we are hosting the workshop Champions for Change, Leading a Backbone Organization for Collective Impact this October 16th through 18th in Los Angeles. Champions for Change is our longest running workshop that focuses on supporting backbone leaders and teams. One note is that the Champions for Change workshop does sell out in advance each time we hold it, so we do encourage those interested to register soon. Early bird registration ends on July 31st, so I highly recommend saving your spot when you can also save on registration. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and for those joining us at our next virtual coffee conversation next week, we look forward to chatting with you then. Have a wonderful afternoon.